I want to address a few common misconceptions using the lens of history, as well as to present a general picture of how many Muslims interpret the narrative of history. So like last night, I want to start by asking you to take a few minutes to explore your own assumptions. The reason why we do this is the assumptions help us understand the frame that we are using to interpreting what is happening in the Muslim world or how we understand history. The lens of history. We are going to use this lens to try to better understand the way that people have viewed and understand Islam. Now, we are all born at a particular time in a particular place, which affects the way we understand the world. Of course, we all know this. We talk about the differences between boomers or Gen Xers or millennials or Gen Z. But when we only interpret events from what is happening in the present, our views tend to be distorted. So you may have seen pictures like this before, where if you look at this picture, you only see squares. But if you step back, and I don't know how well this shows up on your screen, but if you step back and don't focus only on what's happening in a very small square, you begin to see a bigger picture. And if you can see it here, if you step back, you can begin to see the 3 crosses of Calvary that is hidden or embedded in this picture. And history can work the same way. It can function like a pair of corrective glasses that can help clear up an otherwise distorted picture, the nearsightedness that comes from only focusing on the present. And in general, people tend to focus too narrowly on our own experience or the experiences of those in our groups. We tend to focus on what's happening now and how people like us view things. But when we do that, we can easily misunderstand or distort the bigger picture. And so we're going to walk through a few key events that are important in a Muslim narrative of history. And the goal is to help us bring depth to our perspective. Now, one of the greatest accomplishments of Muhammad was in unifying the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. And we talked a little bit about Muhammad last night, but before Muhammad, the Arabian Peninsula was a loose collection of warring tribes. And within 20 years, Muhammad managed to bring all these tribes together under Islam and the worship of one God. But what is more incredible than this unification is the rapid expanse of Islam after the Prophet's death. 2 years after the death of Muhammad, the empire spread to the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. 20 years after the death of Muhammad, Muslims had conquered Persia, and the empire stretched from Tunisia in the east to Afghanistan in the west. Within 150 years, the Muslim empire extended from Spain to Afghanistan. And within 900 years, Islam in some form held sway from Indonesia to Central Asia to Africa to Spain. And then from the 15th century until the 20th century, Islam exercised its power and influence primarily through the Ottoman Empire. So how did this happen? How did a small band of Bedouin tribal people ascend to this incredible place of influence and power on the world stage? Well, it depends on who you ask. Non-Muslim scholars, some non-Muslim scholars would contend that after the unexpected death of Muhammad, the caliphs or the leaders that came after him, the subsequent Muslim leaders, were afraid of the dissolution of the recently unified tribes. And so as a result, these caliphs gave the now Muslim tribes license to turn their traditional raiding exploits against one another, to turn those outward toward Byzantium and Persia. And they argue that these exploits coincided with a weakening Persian empire that had been in a drawn-out war with Byzantium, and that led, these factors together led to the rapid expansion of Islam. Now, most Muslims would interpret these events differently. Muslims believe that the rapid and extensive expanse of Islam is clear proof of God's blessing on the Prophet's message. Much like many Christians view the spread of Christianity or the prosperity of the US related to God's blessing, Muslims look at history and see a similar picture. They argue that the idea that a group of Bedouin tribes could effectively topple the Persian Empire and parts of Byzantium is unfathomable without God's blessing and without God's hand. Now, both non-Muslim and Muslim scholars agree that the success of the Arab tribes in conquering Persia and these areas of Byzantium was an incredible historical feat. So if we think about this, Muslims rose from a small rejected group to the most powerful empire of the day in a very short time. Now, Muslims attribute this rise to the truth of their religion and God's blessing. And then for over 1,300 years, the Islamic Empire was a major world power. So then the question is raised, well, how did Islam spread? Again, history can help us with this question. As I've talked with Americans over the years, I've identified a couple of common misconceptions that I want to bring out tonight. And the first common misconception is related to that question I asked at the beginning. This idea that Islam spread through the practice of forced conversion and at the tip of a sword. Now, the Islamic empires, like all empires, spread through battles and conquests. But the idea that the conquered communities were given the choice to convert or to die is historically false. And if we look at the first Muslim dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, we see a different picture. The Umayyad caliphs were Arab Muslims from the leading families of Mecca, and they established a capital in Damascus, Syria. And these Umayyad caliphs discouraged conversion to Islam because they wanted Islam to keep its Arab identity. So their power was threatened by the conversion of non-Arab Muslims or non-Arabs to Islam. And when Muhammad's successors went on to conquer the Eastern Mediterranean, Iraq, Persia, North Africa, and southern Spain, they viewed these campaigns as wars of conquest, not wars of conversion. Because according to Islamic law, if those they subjugated converted to Islam, then they were required to share the plunder of what they had conquered with those they had conquered. So instead of encouraging conversion, they encouraged the jizya, which is a special religious tax, and they preferred for non-Arabs to stay within their religious communities, which were primarily Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. And so then the question comes, why did people convert? And the growing influence of Islam increased the social pressure to convert. So conversion became the best way to prosper in the new empire. In order to advance within the social ranks of the empire, this required one to be Muslim. In order to avoid the religious tax, the jizya, one had to be Muslim. The conquered peoples, particularly if they lived near a center of Muslim administration, had strong incentives to adapt the dress, manners, language, and eventually the religion of their conquerors. And conversion actually happened gradually. So non-Muslims may have remained in the majority in some Islamic lands until 300 years after the death of Muhammad, though the process of conversion was underway by the 8th century. And what's interesting, having looked and studied Christian history, as I began to study Islamic history, I saw many similarities and parallels in the relationship between the spread of Islam and the spread of Christianity in concert with political power. If we look at the Roman Empire, we see Constantine converted to Christianity in 312. And when he did, it became advantageous to be a Christian. Even more so when Theodosius made Christianity the state religion in 380. And so when Christianity became the religion of the powerful, this led to large-scale conversion in the Roman Empire and to the challenges of faith and power. Similarly, as Islam grew and conquered Persia, when it became the religion of the powerful, this also led to large-scale conversion in the Muslim empire. Now, a second misconception I want to address is the idea that Islam is an intolerant religion that destroys culture. Now, we are familiar with what the Taliban has done when they destroyed the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan. We saw ISIS destroying valuable relics in Syria. We've seen them do terrible things to humans and to human civilization. So a natural question is this what Islam teaches? And again, I believe history can provide some perspective. If we look at the Abbasid dynasty, in 900, the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun set up the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, in Baghdad, and employed scholars from every religious tradition to translate all ancient knowledge into Arabic. So Baghdad became the center of civilization. It was the crossroads between China and the West. And in the 8th century, there were 1 million inhabitants in Baghdad compared to 30,000 in Rome and 5,000 in Paris. And during this time, the philosophy and history and science of the Greeks, Persians, all of what was in Sanskrit, the Syrians, was preserved through this translation effort. And this led to a great flourishing of science and civilization. And under the Muslim leadership, there were great advancements in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, navigation, agriculture, philosophy, medicine. And it was this preservation effort that ultimately led to the revival of humanism and Renaissance ideas in Europe. Now, similarly, in Cordoba and Andalusia, out in Morocco and Spain, the Umayyads, who had lost power in the east to the Abbasids, set up Cordoba as a rival to Baghdad. And they were invited by Christians at that time to set this up. And in Cordoba, Muslims set up a great library of 400,000 volumes. And great debates arose over the use of reason versus tradition. Catholics learned Arabic, since all the great writings were only available in Arabic. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he is talking about Summa contra Gentiles, the Gentiles he's talking about are the Arab philosophers of the day. Churches and mosques often shared the same buildings for worship in Cordoba and Andalusia. And so the question then becomes, whose dark ages are we talking about? When I was in school, I learned about ancient Egypt, I learned about Greece, Rome, and then I learned about the Dark Ages. And then we jumped into Renaissance, Reformation, Renaissance. But in those supposedly dark ages, art, science, philosophy was flourishing in the Islamic world. The Islamic thinkers of this time invented the number system we use today, invented algebra, developed the basic ideas which became the basis for Copernicus's revolution in astronomy. And perhaps most important to many of you, it was the Arabs who discovered coffee in the 8th century and brought it to England in 1650. And it's this preservation effort of the Islamic empires that ultimately led to the revival, again, of humanism and Renaissance ideas. And I can't stress this enough, because the cultural history of the ancient world was preserved and transmitted and added to through the oversight of the Islamic empires and Muslim thinkers. And I stress this because this is not an opinion. No reputable scholar debates this account of history. This is simply the history that I was never taught growing up in the US and was fascinated to find when I moved to the Arab world. Now, a third misconception that I've heard over the years is the idea that there has always been problems between Jews and Muslims, and there always will be, with the subtle undertone or the subtle idea that, this is what the Bible teaches. Now, to think about this again through the lens of history, we see that in Baghdad, in the House of Wisdom, Muslims, Christians, and Jews worked side by side in this translation effort. We see in Andalusia, Spain, Jews, Christians, and Muslims living side by side in relative peace. This was considered a golden era for Jews who found much more tolerance under Muslim rule than they had under the Christian Visigoths, because whereas Christians had pressured Jews to convert, Muslims simply asked that they pay a religious tax. And Jews fought side by side with Muslims at this time against the Christian Visigoths. Now, under Muslim leadership, religious communities were given autonomy to govern their own affairs, and this is clearly reflected in the Ottoman Empire's millet system that allowed self-governance based on religious affiliation. And Jews and Muslims lived side by side in the Syrian province of Palestine through the reign of the Ottoman Empire. But then the question comes, but doesn't the Bible teach otherwise? Well, if we look at that question, Arab and Ishmaelites are rarely mentioned in the Old or New Testament. They are never the main adversaries of the Jewish people. There is one verse, Genesis 16:12, that says that Ishmael will live in hostility toward all his brothers. And there is some controversy of whether or not this means hostility or means that he'll live to the east of his brothers. But this one verse is not a valid justification for why there is not peace in the Middle East. So I want to state clearly that this idea is a bad hermeneutic. It is actually a similar hermeneutic to the one used by Christians for years to justify slavery as biblical on the basis of one verse in the Old Testament that says that Noah's son Ham was going to be cursed. And there were arguments that were developed that saying because of that one verse that Noah's son Ham is cursed, that the African people were descendants of Ham, therefore cursed, and this is what justified slavery. Now, the idea that the Bible teaches that Jews and Muslims can't get along, or that history shows us this, is unfounded. So if we look at a quick summary of this, we see that during the European Dark Ages, Islamic empires in some form were the seat of civilization. So during what I was taught was a dark period of human history, we have full bloom occurring in the Islamic civilizations. These Muslim empires preserved the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, the Persians, the Indians, and Syrians that had been lost to the Western world, and developed the sciences and philosophy. And this transmission of knowledge, as I've already mentioned, in Arabic language, eventually was translated and became the source of revival and Renaissance in Europe. And although the empire was Muslim, Jews and Christians had religious rights under the Muslim leadership, although they did have less power than Muslims in terms of influence and social status. Now, I do want to clarify that I'm not trying to paint a picture where everything was rainbows and sunshine through this period. That's certainly not the case. During this time, there was plenty of turmoil. Religious traditionalists in Islam argued against more liberal-minded leaders. We have Muslim monastic movements that speak out against the corruption of supposedly Muslim leaders. We had Islamic scholars, like I studied the Islamic philosopher Ibn Sina, who was forced to move from place to place, depending on the favor or disfavor of rulers. You know, there's consistent marginalization of the Shiite community by the Sunni majority. We have events where we have the Caliph al-Hakim in Egypt who destroys churches, or the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottomans in 1917. So there's conflict that's occurring during this time, as there always is in a history of humanity. But what I'm trying to highlight is that history also demonstrates that under Muslim rule, there have been periods of great flourishing and peaceful religious coexistence. So if we look at those questions I asked at the beginning in the assumptions, exploring assumption section, if we look at which factor had the greatest impact on growth of early Islam, it was social advantages. If we ask, is Islam an intolerant religion that destroys culture? We have historical evidence that this is certainly not, at least always or the majority of times, the case. That whether or not there's always been or always will be problems between Jews and Muslims, there is no historical evidence to support that idea. And this question of whether or not the US has prospered because God honored the faith of its founding fathers, well, I'll come back to that one. Keep that in mind. as we look at, again, the lens of history through a Muslim perspective. So what happened? That's the key question we want to address. We're going to explore a few more assumptions before we jump into this question of what happened. What I'd like to answer now is, what are one or two reasons from your perspective why you think that Arab Muslims generally have a negative perception of the West? And then I'd also like to see one or two or three key factors that you think led to Nazi extremism or the fanaticism of the KKK in the United States. So if you can look at those questions and drop your answers into the chat, and I'd like to see some of your ideas about these before we jump into the next session. We look at the Arab world in the West, and I've had people ask me questions over the years, and I've understood that really behind the question, although it wasn't always stated this way, is why do they, meaning the Arab Muslim world, hate us, meaning the Western, the US world? And so keep in mind that my goal here is to give you insight into the way that many Arab Muslims understand history. So I'm not arguing that it is an accurate or inaccurate view of history, but I do want you to try to understand the perspective. So during the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire represented the most influential Muslim empire in the world. And during this time, there was a general spirit of openness toward the West. But over the next 100 years, that positive spirit turned into disillusionment and distrust. And there's a couple of key dates to know. First of all, in 1896, Theodor Herzl wrote the book Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State. And it was published, and Theodor Herzl was a secular Jewish journalist who was a writer living in Vienna, who wanted the Jews to have their own state, primarily as a response to European anti-Semitism. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, Austria-Hungary in World War I. And during this period of change, three key pledges were made. In 1916, the British commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, promised the Arab leadership post-war independence from former Ottoman Arab provinces if they fought against the Ottoman Empire. So we have a collection of letters called the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. That was an exchange between July 14th of 1915 to July 30th, 1916. And this is happening during World War I, and it's between the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, and Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Egypt, concerning the political status of lands under the Ottoman Empire. And the Arab sides were already looking toward a large revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And the British encouraged the Arabs to revolt and thus hamper the Ottoman Empire, which had become an ally of Germany in the war after November of 1914. And so these letters declare that the Arabs would revolt in alliance with the United Kingdom, and in return, the UK would recognize Arab independence. Now, at the same time, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement was a treaty between the war victors, Britain and France, with the consent of Imperial Russia and Italy. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the Ottoman Empire into British and French-controlled countries, with borders drawn up entirely by the colonial powers. Now, out of the Sykes-Picot came the outlines of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Then in 1917, the British Foreign Minister, Arthur Balfour, committed Britain to work towards, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And in a letter to leading Zionist Lord Rothschild, this became known as the Balfour Declaration. Now, Arab understanding of the reasons behind the Balfour Declaration is that it's the idea that the UK, that Britain was interested in weakening the Arab world, and it was a way to get rid of their own Jewish problem, to export the Jewish problem somewhere else. Then in 1918, Britain and France occupy the region, and they're assigned as the mandatory powers by the League of Nations on April 25th in 1920. Now, if we jump ahead to World War II, we see that after World War II, the League of Nations announces the creation of Israel in spite of strong Arab opposition. This leads to the First Arab-Israeli War, which Arabs call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And then in 1956, we see that Israel, France, and Britain fought a war with Egypt over the Suez Canal. There was a preemptive strike by Israel, but the war was largely related to Great Britain not wanting to lose control of the Suez Canal when Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it. And while Nasser lost the war in military terms, he gained politically, and this conflict marks a dramatic end of British and French influence in the region and leaves the US poised to become the most influential power broker in the region. In 1967, we have the setback, the Nakba, which is also called the Six-Day War from the Jewish perspective. And here again, there's a preemptive strike by Israel that destroys the Syrian and Egyptian Air Force. And this leads to the defeat and capture of the West Bank. And many people believe that Arab anger arising from this defeat is what prompted the rise of modern radical Islamic and fundamentalist movements throughout the Middle East. Then in 1973, we have the October or Ramadan War, also known as the Yom Kippur War. Here, Egypt launched a war with some initial gains, but then some losses. But this paves the way for the Camp David Accord, which is the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. Also in 1979, we see the Iranian Revolution, which overthrows the American-supported Shah of Iran. And then in 1982, we see Israel occupies southern Lebanon. Israel invades Lebanon all the way to Beirut and eventually occupies that corridor up to Beirut in response to Palestinian and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then in 2000, Hezbollah pushes Israel out of Lebanon and the current border is set. And then I didn't include here the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel and the number of conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians. So when we look at the question of what turned the tide from a positive to a more negative view of the West, we see that after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Muslim revival movements began the discussion of returning to the golden age of Islam against the corruption of the Ottomans. The message was that we have lost the faith of the original believers, the original founding fathers of Islam, the Ashab al-Rasul, that we have lost God's blessing on our religion, which we see in the fact that we have lost power. And religious rhetoric centered on the fall of Islam's influence as a turning away from the quote unquote true Islam. And so we see fundamentalist Muslims like Hana al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood began preaching these pan-Islamic fundamentalist ideas. Now, after World War I, the local Arab Muslim leaders that worked with the occupying powers were seen as having compromised the integrity of Arab nationalism for the sake of power. So if they had worked with the occupying powers, they were delegitimized. After World War II, those that had shook off the European powers were unable to successfully unite and stand against the establishment of the State of Israel. And in the face of repeated defeat and an inability to unite, secular Muslim Arab leaders were seen as corrupt, morally bankrupt, and powerless. And these failures were humiliating, shameful, and were deeply ingrained on the Muslim consciousness. And the reason I asked the question about Nazism or the KKK, it's this type of humiliation of the Germans after World War I that contributed to the rise of Hitler in Germany. This sense of disgrace or the loss of power and extremism often go hand in hand. Now, around the same time, when all this is occurring, in 1938, Saudi Arabia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, and the birthplace of Wahhabism, the most literalist and the most conservative branch of the most conservative and literalist interpretive school in Islam, discovered vast reserves of oil. So this desert area that had been largely insignificant throughout the history of the Islamic empires. So we never see the Islamic empire centered in Saudi Arabia. They're in Syria, they're in Baghdad, they're out in Cordoba and Andalusia. And Mecca and Medina were important religiously, but Saudi Arabia was completely unimportant throughout the history of the Islamic empires. But all of a sudden, they're given great wealth and great influence. And then what also happened is that many of the revivalist thinkers, these who are preaching pan-Islamic fundamentalist ideas, were banished by the regional powers. And when they were banished from Egypt, or they're banished from places in Syria, they found refuge in Saudi Arabia. And in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia became a breeding ground for fundamentalist pan-Islamic ideas. Saudi Arabia and other Arab governments tolerated the spread of pan-Islamic propaganda because it vilified primarily non-Muslim powers and non-Muslim governments. So for Muslim politicians, there was little to gain and much to lose by trying to stem populist pan-Islamism. Instead, by encouraging or allowing it to exist, it had the benefit of diverting attention from domestic political problems with the idea that we should just blame it on the West or blame it on the European powers. Now, at the same time, with its oil wealth, Saudi Arabia has exported Wahhabism throughout the world. It's funded mosques, it's funded preachers, and groups that share its incredibly fundamentalist religious ideology. On top of that, in the 80s, the US Cold War support of the Taliban against the Soviet Union provided a fertile ground for militant Islam to grow. We have US support of oppressive regimes against the USSR, such as Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, which also contributed to a feeling of hypocrisy from the US, which preached democracy while supporting oppressive Arab leaders. So when we talk about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and we ask what are these movements, they are a historically marginalized, fundamentalist, extreme version of Islam that sees its battle against other Muslims and the West as a way to restore Islam to its 7th century roots and its 8th century dominance. So ISIS and Al-Qaeda believe that the Muslim nation faces an existential external threat from both secular, compromised Arab regimes and the West. And they believe that the proper response for Muslims is to fight back, and the justification, because in Islam it must be a defensive battle. The two reasons given to justify this claim is that the religious law commands them to fight in defense of Islam, and that the situation is too dire and the enemy too wicked for a diplomatic solution. So if we were to ask this question, why do they hate us? There are a number of factors that have contributed to the state of the Muslim world today and the general attitude towards the West. There's certainly the idea of a disgraced consciousness, that Muslims see the Christian West in some sense as bringing an end to Islamic dominance, the disgrace of defeat and shame of Western disrespect. A good friend of mine who we worked with in Beirut went to Syria in 1991, and he tells the story of arriving in Damascus and the Syrians asking him, "Why are you here?" And his response of Christian love and charity was, "I'm here to help you." And the response that he received was, "We don't need your help." The response was, "We were one of the most important and most powerful nations for 1,300 years in the history of the world. The US has been around for a couple hundred. We'll figure it out ourselves. We don't need your help." And so there's this sense of pride over Islamic history and power, and a sense of disgrace or a sense of defeat in the fact that they no longer have that power on the world stage. In addition, there's the failure of Arab nationalism and the corruption of Arab leaders. So Arab nationalism was a movement that was trying to bring Arabs from Christian and Muslim backgrounds together in a secular movement, and it failed. And we've seen the corruption of Arab leaders who have taken power in a number of authoritarian regimes. We also see a history of mistrust between the Arab world and the West, that Western powers promised independence for Arab states and repeatedly failed to keep that promise. Along with that is the disillusionment with the West's double standards in supporting the state of Israel and its support of tyrannical Arab regimes, as long as it's in the interest of the United States. So Western powers created, arm, and continue to strongly support the state of Israel as their main ally in the Middle East, while also supporting, like I said, Hosni Mubarak, Saddam Hussein at one time. There is the strong belief in what's called the mu'amara, or the plot, that Western powers want to keep the Arab world weak and want to control the Arab world's wealth in terms of oil wealth. And it's that the belief that the Jewish agenda guides US foreign relations. There's also belief that the US is just another Christian nation in line of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades, and Napoleon that wanted to see Islam and the Muslim world destroyed. And then in addition, we see the financing and proliferation of fundamentalist Islam through the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also the Gulf. And a belief that God will reestablish Islam to its former glory if people return to its quote unquote pure and original message. Now, the purpose of tracing a Muslim perspective of history is to help you understand the emotions and the assumptions that you might find at the foundation of a Muslim worldview, to understand the lens through which people are viewing themselves and their history. And so let me jump back to this last question. The US has prospered because God honored the faith of its founding fathers. I certainly cannot speak for God on this, but let me suggest that history provides a word of caution. As I mentioned, this is the same argument that fundamentalist Muslims use today to justify extremism. They argue that the rise of their influence and empire was because of God's blessing. They believe that the loss of their power and influence was because they walked away from Islam, and their empire stood for over 1,000 years compared to the current state of the United States' influence. I don't know what God is doing in history in this sense, but I do think we need to be careful about the narrative through which we're viewing what's happening in secular nation states. So what do we do? As followers of Jesus, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to change the question. So the question is not whether or not Islam is a violent or peaceful religion. So after each terror incident relating to Muslim extremism, there's endless debate on the meaning of jihad, whether groups like ISIS represent Islam or not, whether Islam is a violent or a peaceful religion. And the sum of all these discussions on jihad and in Islamic thought only leads to the conclusion that it is permissible for a Muslim to use violence under certain circumstances and conditions, which is very similar to the just war debate in Christian tradition, that there is such thing as a just war, or that there's an argument for such thing as a just war in Christian tradition. So the question is about what constitutes a valid use of violence, and that's neither interesting nor useful to try to figure out what constitutes a valid or invalid use of violence. So the main question that fuels extremism is, how do you make sense of the presence of suffering and evil in the world? When a state fails, when its promise to deliver a fair society does not actualize, and others offer a solution that is contrary to that, when the solutions that are being offered seem feeble, it's then that religious extremism emerges as the most powerful and often the only alternative to address the questions of theodicy and recreating a moral order. And radical Islam is an unjustifiable attempt to take control of a world that Muslim extremists feel is out of control and out to get them. So the main challenge that lies before us as followers of Jesus is not whether or not trying to determine whether or not a Muslim can commit an act of terror, but rather how can we present theologies of hope and social change that can address deep grievances and feelings of injustice. And history is a helpful tool for deepening, humbling, and broadening the interpretation of our contemporary experience. Now, I want us to spend just a few moments. It's, I write here, it's often difficult for individuals from a majority culture, which I am from a majority culture, to understand the hopelessness and helplessness that comes from disempowerment, injustice, and disgrace. And it's extreme movements that often promise the hope of control and power. And I think we must consider deeply God's call to confront injustice and what it means to provide hope for the hopeless if we're to present a gospel worthy of being heard.